Episode 92 of the Interpretation Station is Call to Order. Ahlan wa sahlan, welcome everybody, special welcome to all my Arabic-speaking viewers here on the Interpretation Station. You have the honor of being the first episode after the Interpretation's first birthday. So it was the Interpretation Station's first birthday yesterday, 27th of September. That is when I released episode 1, my very first episode on the Democratic Republic of Congo. And as a special treat, you see, for my family yesterday, I sat them down and made them watch the first episode, put them through the misery of watching that first episode. And yeah, and it's quite interesting to see my approach in those early days, very nervous and so on, lots of face rubbing, scratching my nose and things. Yeah, anyway, so there you go. Aren't you the lucky ones? You here to mark, shall we say, the Interpretation Station's first birthday. Now, what have I got for you today, you Arabic-speaking viewers? What have I got for you? Well, it's the subject for the day. It's going to be the issue of enforced and involuntary disappearance. Usually it's just referred to as enforced disappearance. This, I guess, it's a big issue in the Middle East, Arabic world, unfortunately. I guess in many places, but anyway. And if we're going to be working in the political sphere, in the media, you know, it's vocabulary that you really need to be very familiar with. And it's taken from. So I've actually got two statements lined up for you today, not just the usual one. I thought it'd be interesting to look at just two, just to see so for you to see that when you're in these meetings, how very often a lot of these statements sort of align with each other, and you know how if you struggle early on with a statement, provided that you learn your lessons from that statement, you know, pluck out the key vocab as you go along. And you have all these countries often saying very similar things. That's very stated. So the point is, anyway, that if you're just careful and you don't let yourself get too disheartened by difficulties you may have with initial statement, that you can sort of redeem yourself later on. Now, the meeting in question is it was on the 21st of September. So just last week, just exactly a week ago, in fact. Interactive dialogue with the working group on enforced or involuntary disappearances. And I've got statements for you by Egypt and by Iraq. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to leave a card up here or up there. I did an episode. An early episode that I did was actually a statement by one of the special rapporteurs on enforced disappearance, I think it was. It was in Spanish, okay, so it was a Spanish to English episode, if you like. But I give an introduction at the beginning, just setting out some of the key vocab that you need to know in this subject. So it might make, as I say, if you're expecting to do a meeting on that subject, it might be worth having a quick look at that intro that I do. I take you through one of the conventions, and again, basically highlighting the key resolutions, the key words, and so forth. Okay, well, with that little introduction, let's get cracking with the statements that we've got. And at the end, I will obviously, I'm going to do a quick sight translation of the two texts, again, just to replicate a little bit interpreting conditions. Before we start, this is a good moment just to remind you, if you're watching the show, if you're enjoying it, please remember to like, give me a thumbs up, and to subscribe. And if you like, you can share it as well with your buddies. Okay, so let's start off then with the Arab group. So Egypt speaking on behalf of the Arab group. Now you should be able to see that statement up on the screen, and I have highlighted the interesting vocab, at least as far as I'm concerned, interesting vocab, the statement, and let's see how I would do it. Okay, so the first thing I've highlighted here is the sort of standard phrase. So again, you have to forgive me if I make mistakes with my pronunciation. I'm doing my best. Okay, so المجموعة العمل المعنية بالاختفاء القسري وغير التوعية. So that is enforced or involuntary disappearance, okay? اختفاء قسري. And what I will do when I'm working, if I have to do this into English from one of my other languages, I will often compress enforced disappearance down into ED. I might say, okay, the working group on enforced disappearance, or ED. That way I can use ED later on in the text, because the chances are they're going to refer to it quite a bit, right? And I tell you what, it's a lot easier just to say ED than enforced disappearance. To be honest, the involuntary part of it tends to get lost in the focus tends to be more on the enforced, and the involuntary is sort of rarely mentioned. Okay, now this bit I thought is interesting. So بما جاء في التقرير, and I noticed this is in Arabic. This is a sort of device that seems to be used quite frequently. To be honest, when in English, when we sort of whatever it is, take note of or welcome reports, we just tend to take note of the report. Okay, we tend to welcome the report. In this case, okay, أخذت علما, to take note of. Now, if you want to reflect that idea of what's actually in it, so the idea I had was we take note of the findings of the report. Okay, so the findings it's a very sort of neutral word, and it just sort of basically covers everything that's in it. So I think you can use either or. So I asked my friend Mohammed Asi, who made a video, one of the videos with me, an episode a little while ago, and he said he'll often just say, take note of the report. But as I say, if you want to reflect that, بما جاء فيه, I think findings, we welcome the findings of the report. And then قيود النظر, under consideration, would be the standard way of doing it. Although sometimes if I'm in a real hurry, if I'm falling behind, I'll just say before us. Okay, it's a bit quicker to say. These are very standard openings that you almost want to remember sort of by heart, because what will often happen now with RSI is that they'll try and they'll try and connect with the speaker, and the speaker thinks he's connected, and he thinks everyone can hear him, and he'll start speaking, but it'll take a few seconds often for the audio to kick in for us interpreters, right? By which time he's already sped through this whole sentence. So in a way, you want in your head already before you start to have a sort of set, standardized opening that you can just quickly say, we welcome the special rapporteur, and we thank him for his report and the findings therein. Something like that. Find in your own head just a quick set piece that you can just throw out really quickly, so that to allow you to catch up, because it's always more or less the same. The opening salvo is almost always the same. It's all welcoming the rapporteur, thanking him for his report, taking note or whatever of the findings. Okay, then كشف عن مصير ومكان المدعي. So this is an important expression when it comes to ED, to enforce disappearance. So establishing the fate and whereabouts. Okay, that's a real classic package when it comes to the issue of enforced disappearance. The fate and whereabouts. Yeah, you can say location, makan, I suppose, but whereabouts is very much the word in vogue. And then, so again, I was asking Mohammed about this expression, al-muda'a al-اختفاء هم قسرية, because to be honest, in English, they will just tend to talk about, establishing the fate and whereabouts of the victims. Okay, of enforced disappearance. Now, this is this word, I guess, it has the emphasis of that, the alleged victims of enforced disappearance. So you'd probably want to say something like alleged victims of enforced disappearance. Maybe you could say alleged ED victims. So something quick. You want to try and, again, compress it into something fair, distill it down into something that you can say fairly quickly. So again, Mohammed was saying that you probably want to get this notion here of the alleged as well. He says that's quite important idea. So I would perhaps say the fate and whereabouts of alleged ED victims. Okay, ma'arafa al-haqiqa. So this is a typical English collocation. You want to say to ascertain the truth, establish the truth for that. Then here, Adam istighlal wilaya. Now, how do you get that? Adam istighlal. So So obviously, literally, it means, I guess, the non-exploitation of the working group's mandate. But again, that sounds a bit awkward in English. So if I was if I was speaking in English, I'd want to say, including establishing the credibility of reports. And I think your best bet is to go with preventing the exploitation of the working group's noble mandate, as opposed to the non-exploitation. That sounds ugly in English. So I think in a lot of I think this is going to come up again later. This use of Adam. In fact, you can see it here. You'll see it in a minute. I think on a lot of instances, maybe the best thing to go with is to prevent. As this is my reading of, obviously, as I see it, as Arabic for me is just a hobby. It's not a job, but to me that seems the most natural way of doing that in English, to prevent the exploitation of the mandate. And then, okay, التشهير بالدول. So here Muhammad said the best thing to go for with tashhir would be to defame, defame countries. And you've got other sort of synonyms to defame, such as, to slander, to libel. They're getting quite technical. I mean, in English, to slander is when you say untruths about someone. When you speak them, libel is specifically for writing about them. So I guess with defame, that more or less covers both bases. And then this sentence here, okay, لتحقيق مكاسب ذات بعد سياسي. So I guess, so again, تحقيق مكاسب, to derive political rather than humanitarian gain, to derive so derive is very much a word, it's a very high register, okay? When you talk about benefit or advantage, you can derive gain, derive benefit, derive advantage from a slightly lower register, maybe to obtain, or maybe you could just slightly reformulate this by saying, for the purposes of political rather than humanitarian gain, or just for political rather than humanitarian gain. So there's a few little ways of doing it. But as I say, that to derive gain from something, that's a high register way of expressing that. And so here we go again with Adam Tabrir al-Ikhtifa. So here so it calls on the Arab group, calls on the working group. It highlights the importance of non-justification of ED. So I think in English the most natural thing here to say would be of never justifying. I guess you could say not justifying, but to be honest, when you in English you reiterate the importance of not doing something or calling on not doing, which I see it comes up quite a bit, for example, in Arabic. I think it sounds more natural in English to say on the importance of never justifying, never rather than just not. Not wouldn't be wrong, but I think never sounds better in English. And then here, classic collocation here, countering terrorism is the best from مكافحة. Okay, countering terrorism, combating terrorism as well, but counter tends to be the sort of generally accepted best collocation. This is القانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان, international human rights law, for which unfortunately there's not really an acronym. So international humanitarian law, there is an acronym, IHL, but international human rights law, there doesn't tend to be much of an acronym in English. I just say that I cite international humanitarian law because often these two will come as a package, IHL and international human rights law. زعزع الاستقرار. That's a fun word to say, isn't it? Zaza. I would say undermine stability is probably the best way to go here. Subvert the stability. Again, here we have this again, tahqiq and makasib. So there's a lot of use. This word comes up a lot in these texts, makasib. So again, deriving gain, achieving gain. One of those two, again, achieving, deriving, benefit, gain, advantage. So mix and match. Down here, okay, the al-majmu'a al-amal al-muwaqqara. The only reason I highlighted that was, okay, so you could say, the distinguished working group or the esteemed working group. To be honest, often when I'm working and they throw that if it's a tough statement, and then they throw that in. It's like a word that I think can almost be dropped. It doesn't really add much. It's not a very important adjective in the grander scheme of things. I mean, if I was to say it, you'd say the distinguished or the esteemed working group. But also, I would, if I was under pressure, I'd probably just let it go. Then مصداقية الأدعاءات التي يلتقها. The credibility of I would say for al-ada'at is the reports, the missing persons, the people who have been disappeared, those cases are reported. Okay, so I think that's perhaps the best verb to go with. So the reports, the credibility of the reports that they receive. And then this is another classic collocation again in the English, الإفاء بالولايات الإنسانية, to deliver on their humanitarian mandate, to live up to their humanitarian mandate, for example. And here, this end bit again, تحقيق العدالة, to ensure justice, and حفظ الكرامة الإنسانية, preserve human dignity. I would say is the best way to go there. So what I'll do is I'll just give a quick run through of this statement, and then we'll move on to the one by Iraq. So here I go. Okay, thank you, President. The Arabic group welcomes this interactive dialogue with the working group on enforced and involuntary disappearance. We take note of the findings of the report before us. The Arab group supports the group's humanitarian mandate in establishing the fate and whereabouts of alleged victims of ED. I'll probably put a full stop here, okay? This is what Muhammad advised when you have a sentence being idhan, so he says that he tends to put a full stop just before and then start a new sentence, which would go along the lines of ensuring justice for them requires concerted efforts to ascertain the truth, including confirming the credibility of reports and preventing the exploitation of the group's noble mandate by certain parties to defame other countries or to obtain political rather than humanitarian gain. Now, he also said that ala raghmi min he will often drop that, and he will just launch straight into the sentence and then adapt the rest of the text around it. So I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to go with Muhammad's tip. So he would say that the Arab group is aware of the recommendations of the working group as to the importance of never justifying ED on the grounds of protecting national security or countering terrorism. And this is consistent with international human rights law. Full stop. However, the group would reiterate that the goals of terrorism are to undermine stability, security, and community peace by achieving benefit in line with their ideology, and then full stop. So this is where he would have said he would adapt. He'd say the however, and that gives the same meaning as it would have by having this one huge long sentence that starts with despite. So I quite like that approach. I do something similar, I know, when you're going from French into English, right? And you have those sentences that begin with si, and you're never 100% certain if that si is going to be an if clause or if it's going to be a while clause. Like, while that is a good idea, on the other hand. And so at least going from French, one way of getting around that is to just drop the si and then just start out as an affirmative, as a statement, and then you throw in the qualifier later as you see the direction in which that sentence is going. So I guess this is a sort of similar tactic here to be used maybe in Arabic. So anyway, that's just what he recommended to me. So I'm just passing that on to you. Among its tools are exploiting the humanitarian dimension of international human rights instruments. In that context, the Arab group calls on the working group to adopt more effective mechanisms to ensure the credibility of the reports it receives. The members of the Arab group are committed to continuing work with the working group to make good on its humanitarian mandate and to ascertain the truth and ensure justice and preserve human dignity. Okay, so that's how I would do it. I've had a few shots at this, but that's not my first time. But I hope that maybe gives you a few useful ideas. Okay, let's try in Iraq. And you'll see now that there's a lot of consistency, as I say, between that statement delivered by the Arab group and what Iraq's about to say. So you can very much learn from early statements. That's one of the actually pretty basic strategy, for us interpreters. When you're in a meeting, follow the early statements, see which way they're going, see what vocab is being used, note it, make a note of it, look it up if you're not certain of it, and then you can impress everybody later on when those expressions are used a second and third time. Okay, so very first word here I highlighted in the Iraq statement because I wasn't 100% certain of it. So when I looked it up, in at least Google Translate, the first solution it gives you is to share. Okay, the Arab group shares the report of the working group. So again, I asked Mohammed here, and so he says that with atla. I'm going to check. What's the better pronunciation for that? That's one of those words that throws me when it comes to pronunciation. Atla. Okay, so he says he always just goes with takes note of. So sometimes with certain words to cut out any confusion, sometimes it's best just to have one go-to word and just run with that. So he would say here that the working group, or rather the Iraq, takes note of the report. And again, I've just highlighted this set expression, for enforced and involuntary disappearance. And by this time, by the way, I would probably just be saying ED all the time. As I say, you use it the first time in a meeting, and then after that, just run with the acronym. This is a very straightforward word. I just thought I'd just remind Yuthman, so to commend, to applaud. All right, welcome. Just always remember that a few of those synonyms there. Okay. Oh, this is an interesting one. Okay. This word here, tarikat thaqila. Now, why do I say it's interesting? It's because of the adjective that's used with it. The idea of this heavy legacy. Now, we can sort of say that in English because a heavy legacy. People would know what you mean. It's just that it doesn't sound quite right. We use heavy, to be honest, if anything in English, heavy is a word we use, it's almost in slang. Like, that's a really heavy situation. Whoa, man, that's heavy. But in a statement like this, I think we tend to talk more, when we're talking about legacies, perhaps we say the painful legacy, or the somber legacy, the grim legacy. When we talk about legacy, we have that idea of a shadow, falling over us. My favorite option of those, I think, there would be perhaps the painful legacy. Okay, مقابر جماعية. Okay, so this is mass graves. That's what we call them, not common graves. And look, in French again, they talk about les fossés communs. But no, so in English we always talk about mass graves. So just remember that as a sort of like for like rendering, if you like, for that. معالجة ذلك. Okay, so here they're talking about, well, remedying that situation. So with mileage, I think you can say remedy, right? The only thing I'd say here is like when you remedy something, it means, it's the idea of you fix it. Unfortunately, the issue with mass graves, you're not going to fix that, are you? That can't be that can't be undone. So I think perhaps you'd want to talk about, addressing this, probably keep it neutral, addressing this issue. Another idea, just an idea for you, is another expression that we use a lot in English when it's something bad has happened and we're trying to address it. We're trying to come to terms with it. So as perhaps thinking, it takes a few more words, come to terms with, the institutions, the competent institutions today are working on coming to terms with this. So that's just an idea for you. That's an expression you hear a lot in English, in generally spoken English, media English, whatever. كشف عن هوية ضحية. So here again, ascertain the identity, establish the identity of the victims. Again, establish and ascertain, they're two good sort of synonyms to know. Now, and this is a slightly interesting, this is a bit of an interesting phrase here. بسبب أعمال الزمن والعبث. Now we talk about the time factor, okay? So in English here, we do talk in general about, there's always the time factor to worry about. The tampering factor, on the other hand, doesn't sound like good English. I mean, if I was to interpret that word for word, it would be because of the factors of time and tampering. Factor of time, yes, but to be honest, there's not really such thing as the tampering factor. That sounds strange. If I was to do this into English, I'd probably say something along the lines then of maybe because of the time factor and because of tampering. I'd probably repeat, I wouldn't put the time and tampering, as it were, on an equal grammatical footing. So I would probably just to make it sound better. So definitely we talk about the time factor in English, but tampering you'd probably want to have as just a slightly separate idea. And again, here you have these expressions that running through both these texts. كشف عن مسير المدعى اختفائهم قسريا. So what do we say? To establish the fate of alleged ED victims, the alleged victims of enforced disappearance, establishing the fate of those alleged to have been disappeared. You see, that takes a lot of time to say, of those alleged to have disappeared. Oh, that's hard to get out. It's all right if the speaker's going slowly, but again, you probably want something quicker to say here. And I think alleged ED victims sort of trips off the tongue quite nice. And again here, to pick up this sort of, picks up on what I was saying before, يدعو إلى عدم استغلال. It calls on the relevant efforts to prevent the exploitation. Adam istiglal. So it's like in the previous statement. I think here again, the Adam, maybe the easiest route to take is to go with the prevent the exploitation, prevent the abuse, or prevent the manipulation of the humanitarian mandate. Again, so you want for exploit a couple of different synonyms. تقديم بلاغات مظللة. Okay, so this word, I've highlighted this. So this is a sort of fixed expression in the we call the treaty bodies. Okay, so these are all, again, the treaty bodies are all those committees in Geneva that deal with all these, that ensure compliance with all the various human rights conventions. Now they receive communications from people who are reporting cases of disappeared persons. Communications is very much the sort of the bureaucratic word that they use. There's even a thing, often many of these conventions have what's known as a communications procedure. So I would definitely use communications for that word here. I don't know if in other contexts you might use something different, but here in the UN, go with communications. And for mudallala, I was thinking, again, discussed this with Mohammed, so misleading, spurious, words like that. And again, similar to what they were talking about in the previous statement, maybe you would, to keep the syntax, the same flow of the syntax, you'd maybe say submitting misleading communications of a political or defamatory nature. You throw in the nature at the end just so that, in English, that it sounds nice, so that it sounds right. Okay. Slanderous nature, I guess. But again, defamatory is perhaps the most neutral of those words. Slander, libel, and so on. Now I highlighted this, okay, the month. So I know this is January, right? Kanuna Thani. And the reason I highlighted it was I understand that in certain Arabic-speaking countries, so Muhammad tells me in Morocco and Egypt, that you tend to use the months like January, February, December, August, whatever, and that sometimes you're not as used to using the Arabic name of the month. And it reminds me of a little anecdote I'm going to tell you. So in 2014, so I did an internship at the European Parliament, and I went, and they have Croatian at the European Parliament, and so I'm half Serb, half Serbian, okay? Serbian, Croatian, extremely similar languages. Okay, I call them Jedi on this channel. They're very, very, very close. Okay, the difference is like, I don't know, Spanish from Spain and Spanish from Latin America. But the one big difference between the two languages is that while Serbian uses Januar, Februar, Mart, April, they're very similar to the months that we use. Croatian uses a completely different set of months. And they all refer to nature, the falling of the leaves, the winds, or whatever. And I had to learn that. One thing I had to really make a point of doing was to learn those months in Croatian. And so, if you were to, that was 6 years ago now. So if you were to tell me a Croatian month, I've forgotten them. I can't remember them. Some of them I remember vaguely what season they are. So the suggestion I was going to make here, that if you happen to be, I don't know, if you're Egyptian or Moroccan and you hear that month that you're not used to hearing all the time, but you know roughly when it is in the year, you could just say, during the winter of 2022 or in early 2022. Okay, that's a legitimate tactic that we interpreters can use if you have that moment of doubt, but roughly, for example, when it is. I mean, you could just say in 2022, but perhaps you want to be slightly more specific. So if you know that, I know that Kanuna Thani somewhere at the beginning of the year, you can say in early 2022. Anyway, that's just a little aside that I thought it was interesting, based on my experience with the Croatian months. Okay, في الوفاء تزمناته. Okay, so again, just to deliver on the international commitments, make good on, live up to, comply with, loads of them, but just remember them anyway. It's good for you to hear me saying them, right? Right? Okay. تأكيد من مصداقية العادات. So again, this is to confirm the credibility of reports, okay, of missing persons that they receive. Again, this came up in the Arrow Group statement as well, to ascertain the credibility, the veracity of reports. And this last bit here, okay, مناج الموائمة. Now, I realize that mu'ema is perhaps usually harmonize, right? I mean, you would probably hear, when I read the whole sentence to the end, the word that would best fit in English is reconcile, okay? In order to reconcile fighting terrorism and protecting national security on the one hand, with establishing the veracity of reports and their consistency with the working group's mandate on the other. So reconcile is the word that would best fit in English, certainly. Now, I don't know, I get the impression that in Arabic, the first word that comes for you to mind when doing al-mu'atima is, would it be to harmonize? So I was thinking, okay, if I had to use harmonize, if I go in order to harmonize the countering terrorism and protecting security on the one hand, and establishing the veracity of reports and their consistency with the mandate of the working group. I mean, harmonize, I think people would understand what you were saying. Another idea that's just come to me, when you hear that, minaj al-muwa'ima bayna, of saying perhaps striking a balance between, could that be a good neutral way of approaching an expression like that? So I'm really just putting that out there. I'm interested because I don't know if you were to hear minaj al-muwa'ima bayna, I don't know if reconcile would be the first word that would naturally spring to mind to you guys going from Arabic into English. Something like striking a balance is a very sort of, as I say, a very neutral expression that you can sort of adjust in the English as you go along. So anyway, I don't know. I'm just putting those suggestions out there for you. And as I say, so here I was just talking again about al-kashf and haqiqa, so establishing, ascertaining the veracity of the reports and their consistency with the mandate. Okay, so now that we've been through that, let me go speed through, do another quick sort of sight translation of this one for you, just to see how I would do it. Okay, thank you, President. Human Rights Council has a president, remember? Okay. Iraq takes note of the report of the working group on on enforced and involuntary disappearance, and while Iraq commends the humanitarian mandate of the working group, we would make the following remarks. One, Iraq has suffered from a painful legacy, so we talk about suffering from a legacy, of mass graves and ED in the times of the former regime. Its institutions, the relevant institutions, are working today on addressing this, on coming to terms with this, in spite of the difficulties that they face in establishing the identity of the victims in the mass graves due to the time factor and due to tampering. Iraq reiterates its commitment to support the mandate of the working group and to work with it to establish the fate of alleged ED victims. We call on concerted efforts to avoid exploitation of the group's humanitarian mandate and the submission of misleading communications of a political or defamatory nature. Iraq welcomed recently the request for a visit that was submitted by the working group. We proposed to them a date to conduct the visit during early 2022. This reflects the Raghba as-Sadiqa, the genuine willingness, the sincere wish of Iraq to make good on its international commitments in that regard. Iraq would like to ask the working group what instruments it adopts to confirm the credibility of the reports it receives, and what is the best approach required in order. What is the best approach that should be adopted by states to reconcile countering terrorism, preserving security on the one hand, and ascertaining the truth or the veracity of reports and their consistency with the working group's august mandate on the other hand. or their noble mandate on the other hand. Okay, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, President, rather. Okay, so I hope you've had, gives you a few ideas to chew over. Please, in the comments, as I say, if you have suggestions of your own, please do put them. I'm trying to, this is a vehicle for me also to try and improve my understanding of Arabic. The idea is that in improving my own understanding of Arabic, that I can also improve your knowledge of English. I can increase your vocabulary, increase the amount of options open to you when you're at work going from Arabic into English. So as I say, the idea is that we can both derive some mutual benefit. So yeah, please do put anything, any comments, any suggestions that you have in the comment box. Like, subscribe, share, all that kind of nonsense. Guys, again, it's been a pleasure doing these episodes with you, and nothing is left to say other than keep following me, by the way, on the LinkedIn group. Tell your friends about it. I'm doing my best putting up all the site translations there a lot of the time. So yeah, follow me there as well. Follow me here on the channel, and I'll see you soon. Episode 92 of the Interpretation Station stands adjourned.